Dora, thank you so much for joining us and being willing to be our first person today. Thank you. You have so much to share with us in our short 1 hour together. In fact, less than that now, so we'll get right to it. You were 3 years old when World War II came directly to Yugoslavia in the spring of 1941 when it was attacked by Germany. Before we turn to the horrors of the war and the Holocaust, start first by telling us about your family and your community in the years before the war.
My family hadn't been in Croatia for a very long time when the war actually happened. By very long time, I mean not for generations. My father was actually born in Romania, but they immigrated into Yugoslavia when he was a very young child. And then they settled in Zagreb. My mother's family came to a small town of Ludovic, which is on the very far north of Zagreb, near the Hungarian border. And they came so that my grandfather could serve as rabbi to the small Jewish community that was there. They actually came from Slovakia, and they had, when they arrived, they had 2 children, and then they had 2 more, including my mother. My mother was the youngest. And by the time war started, my grandfather had been the rabbi of that community for 40 years.
For 40 years.
For 40 years. So they had been living there for a long time, just not for generations. By the time war came around, all the children of my mother's family had been settled, had been working. My mother in particular became a teacher, and elementary school teacher, and then married my father, who came in from Zagreb, and they moved to Zagreb. The other children in the family, especially important members of the family to me, were my mother's sister, Blanca, who was married and had 2 children, and the sister who was older and who was actually born outside of Croatia, who arrived with the parents early on. She was 15 years older than my mother, so she was almost sort of a quasi-mother to my mother, and she played a very large role. She's the one whose picture you just showed.
This is Aunt Giza.
That's Aunt Giza, yeah. She was 15 years older than my mother, so she very much took care of my mother and eventually took care of me. My father, as you said, ran this factory of brushes. He actually learned the craft and then started the business of his own, and by the time war started, there were about 12 workmen, and they were prospering and doing well, and so that's more or less the family.
You had explained to me that in Ludovic, your mother's hometown, where you were during the war years, that had been an integrated community. What did you mean by that?
I mean that there was actually some, but very little in comparison to other places, overt anti-Semitism. People prospered. My grandfather had only minor events that would be labeled as anti-Semitic events, and he served as a translator in the court for German and Hungarian, and he also taught Jewish children in the religious classes that they had in the elementary school. So the elementary school children had religious education as part of their day, the Catholic priest and the Orthodox, I mean Serb Orthodox minister was there, and my grandfather then taught the Jewish children. So the Jewish community was rather small, but fairly well-to-do, and they were either store owners, or there was a lawyer, there was a doctor. So it was, and the interesting thing is that you take a look at pictures which are available online, you take a look at pictures of the community, and there are tennis clubs and Jews and Catholics playing together. By the way, this was practically 90%, 100% Catholic world, Roman Catholic world. And there were some Serb Orthodox villages around there, but generally this is a Catholic world. But there was social integration, and certainly economic and educational integration.
Thank you for explaining that. When Germany launched its attack on Yugoslavia on April 6, 1941, you were away from Zagreb, on a visit with relatives in Ludbreg. Tell us what you can about what you know about the circumstances as to why you were away from your family and what happened once the Germans came into Yugoslavia.
I was away because, well, I was 3 years old, and my mother, my parents just had another baby, my brother. He was 3 years younger. We were both born in January, 3 years apart. A neighbor from Ludbreg came to visit, and my parents decided to send me to visit with my grandparents because there was an opportunity to get me on the train. And I have that image yet. Being on the train was very exciting, even though I was very young, I remember. So I still don't know actually why I was sent. Did they know? They all knew that the war was imminent, but I don't really think that that was the reason they sent me. I think they sent me because, first of all, to just visit grandparents and aunts and so on. The other one, possibly because my mother just had a baby, so it was a good thing to send me away for a bit of time. So I just happened to be at my grandparents' in that April when Germany invaded.
I'm going to jump in for a minute,
Yeah.
Dora. You said they knew that war was probably imminent. Did your parents or other members of the family, did anybody make attempts to try to leave Yugoslavia before the Germans came in?
Not before. There was actually no place to go. That was the problem, and that's what we are talking about a lot these days. It's, people say, why didn't you all leave? But there was no place to go. So that was one thing. And the other thing is that I don't think they knew exactly how things are going to work out. Eventually, some people tried to leave, and my aunt and uncle with my two cousins did manage to get passes to leave. Where to? To the Italian zone. Croatia was when I don't want to jump ahead, but what happened when Germany invaded? The country of Yugoslavia fell apart, more or less into the same parts that it's in now, in that Croatia became a country, Slovenia, Serbia, and so on were really taken over by Germany. But the part of Croatia that's along the Adriatic, which everybody these days wants to visit, it's Dalmatia, it's very beautiful, that was actually occupied by Italy. And Italians were, I think it was known, I don't know, that Italians dealt with Jews in a much more humane way than the Germans. And then it turned out that the local population did not deal with Jews very well. How did Croatia become a country all of a sudden by itself? It was certainly not an independent country, though that's exactly what it's called itself. It's called itself Independent State of Croatia, Nezavisna država Hrvatska. It was a puppet government. How did that become so? There was a political right, very nationalistic right, that wanted to have Croatia, just Croatia by itself, without any other members of former Yugoslavia, which of course Yugoslavia became a country after World War I.
Right.
So they wanted to have the Jews talked about Judenfrei, that means free of Jews, and Croats wanted it free of everybody else as well. So Croatian right wing did not succeed. These nationalists, the Ustaše, that's what their name was, did not succeed in taking over the country by democratic means. So they made a pact instead with, they went to Italy on their own and they got themselves together. They made a pact with Germany, with Hitler, and there is a picture you can see with Pavelić, the head of that government, eventual government, shaking hands with Hitler. They made a pact. You Germans, let us run this country, and we will do whatever you want us to do, and we'll all be nice friends.
So that's how the Ustaše was in
That
control.
is how the Ustaše came to power, into power. And of course, then they, as they said, they would run everything exactly the way the Jews wanted them. I mean, the way Germans wanted them. That's exactly what they did. Just to finish the question, my aunt and uncle and two cousins managed to get this passes to go to the Italian zone, but unfortunately never made it all the way. The Pavelić, the head of the government, said, "Oh, you just return and you'll be fine." He made a proclamation, and they believed it, and so they returned to Ludovic, only to be sent to concentration camps in a very short period of time.
Very short time. Your Aunt Giza and your Uncle Ludovic and other family members in Ludbreg, they learned that your parents had been arrested and sent to a concentration camp, but that your brother had been saved from deportation. Tell us about what happened to your parents and about your brother and how you were able to be reunited with your brother. Because remember, you told us you were away at that time.
Right. Actually, my parents got, the deportation started very fast after the Ustaše took over. They barely had the time to establish camps, and they were starting to deport people, and first were putting them into former hospitals or other places where they could find spaces, but eventually there were camps. And when my parents were my parents were taken fairly early, and they were not yet in camps. That's not exactly they were in the transfer camp, sort of. They were still in Zagreb before they were actually shipped away totally. Our housekeeper found out that what's happened, and she went and asked the Ustaše if she could have my baby brother. And my mother then handed the baby over and they allowed it, and she gave the baby to the housekeeper with the hope, of course, that she would call the relatives and that he would be safe, which she did. And so she called my aunt and my uncle Ludva, and they came to get him. And I have a fairly clear memory of his arrival. As he was a baby, he was crying. And you know.
But that's one of the early memories that you have of
Yeah.
him coming into the house.
Right.
In 1942, your parents have been deported. You and your baby brother now are living with your aunt and uncle. In 1942, your uncle Ludovic himself was arrested and sentenced to the Jasenovac concentration camp. You and your brother remained with your aunt Giza. Tell us about your uncle's imprisonment in Jasenovac, and then what that meant for you and your brother and living with Aunt Giza. And I think it might be worth explaining a little bit about Uncle Ludovic.
Yes, and also probably backing off a little bit time-wise, because in 1942, what happened was all the Jews of Ludbreg were deported. So that happened much before my uncle was deported.
Because he was not Jewish.
He was not Jewish. And that's what we need to explain.
Yep.
Yes. My aunt Giza and Ludovic Vrancic were in love for a very long time. He was, as I mentioned, that she was 15 years older than my mother, and he was 10 years older than she, which played a role later on. He was her boss in a sense. She was working in the local bank, and he was one of the directors of the bank. And they were in love, but they did not get married for a very long time. And he survived, I can say. So later on, I used to ask him, well, why did you not get married for such a long time? And he would say, well, she was very happy living with her mother, with her parents, and I was happy living with my mother, so there was no need. But of course, it's an excuse, I'm sure. He didn't want to ever say, well, you know, she was Jewish and I was not, and there were problems. The problems were not of the kind that one can imagine. There was no problems within the family. And there is a picture which people can see online if they want, of the whole family, and everybody is Jewish except my uncle, who is in the center. This is a picture of my parents' wedding. And so he was always included in everything. But neither was converting to the other's religion. And there was no civil ceremony, civil marriage available in Yugoslavia. And
they were all religious marriages.
There were only religious marriages. And so at one point, just before the war started, so the war was already raging in the rest of Europe, they went to Hungary, which had a civil ceremony, civil system of marriage. And they got married. So they got married in '39. And they thought, of course, that it would save her, because they have heard that sometimes in mixed marriages, the spouse that was not Jewish could save the spouse who was Jewish. So they got married. So that's who they were. Living also again in Ludbreg, and everybody was there. 1942 came.
I might mention one other thing, and your uncle Ludovic was a fairly prominent man.
He was a very prominent man. Well, as I said, he was a bank director, and he had been a mayor, and he was very well known, very highly respected in that town, and he was totally into music, played the violin, had a group to play chamber music and to play fun things, and was truly a pillar of that society. And actually, that family was sort of a minor aristocracy, but strangely enough, not very healthy. So that his brothers and sisters pretty much died young, and none of them married before dying. They were all young, dying of tuberculosis and all kinds of things that people used to die of that we would now cure with penicillin. But so that by the time I came on the scene, there was only one sister alive of the 12 of them, and she she had not married, so she was older than he. So she's the only person that I actually ever got to know of that family, except very distant cousins. Anyway, so back to the deportations.
Yeah.
Deportations were awful. I have that is one memory that I have. It was 42, so I was like 4 years old, a little more than 4, but I remember everybody coming to our house. I was now living with Stričak Ludva and his wife Giza, and everybody coming, carrying satchels and pillows. I remember pillows, and saying goodbye to me and crying. And my brother and I were there, and I'm sure I didn't know what was going on, but I know that everybody else was very upset, and so it was upsetting to me as a child. And that was that. They disappeared, and they were off to, which became a horrible camp Jasenovac.
We'll come back to that. So here you are with your aunt and uncle, and then your uncle, who's not Jewish, he gets arrested.
Yes, well, there is a reason for that, and I need to start with. The reason for that was, and that was already 43 now, somewhat later. The reason for that was that even though Croatia was so happy to accept all of the German Nuremberg laws, a lot of people did not go along with that. And of course, Croatia now had its own army, its own laws. All the laws that they promulgated were the same laws that Germany had, absolutely.
So all the restrictions?
All the restrictions, all the no jobs, no school. You had to, all your worldly goods were confiscated. You had to write down absolutely everything you owned. There are papers in this museum that we found where my little cousins had to write down. They had to write down, one necklace, one winter coat, 3 dresses, everything. Everything had to be said, had to be reported, and could be taken away. Of course, housing, all of that. So a lot of people didn't go along with that. To many in Croatia at the time, hats off, because they actually did not only just didn't go along quietly, but they went into the mountains and they became a partisan force. And it started slowly, and more people went, and eventually it became quite a force that fought the Nazis.
And the Ustasha.
So now you had the Ustasha force. I saw very few Germans at any point. We mostly saw Ustasha forces and the partisan forces. And there was constant fighting. Now we go into the part where the partisans would be in the hills nearby, and the Ustasha were bivouacked in the town, and partisans would attack, and sometimes, and those were horrible fights, and sometimes the Ustasha would win, and sometimes partisans. And twice Ludbreg was actually liberated for a certain period of time. But since the Ustasha were not very happy, of course, with the partisan attacks and some successes, they would look for who is responsible. And one of the things that they said, well, the people in town are probably helping them. So what they did is they gathered some of the well-regarded people in town, including my uncle, and there were about 5 of them, I think, and they sent them to Jasenovac. That is how he ended up in Jasenovac. Now, the difference between sending Jews to Jasenovac and sending somebody like my uncle was, in a sense, that he was a prisoner of war. I'm sorry, he was a
Like a political prisoner.
A political prisoner, thank you. He was a political prisoner. And so political prisoners were treated somewhat differently. They were actually given a sentence of sort. On the other hand, Jews, like the first group of my family that went, they were just killed outright or put to work, and if they survived on extremely meager circumstances with hardly any food and hardly any shelter from cold and miserable weather, then that's that. The people would be thrown in the river, hung, hit. I was told that my grandfather never made it into the camp, that he was hit on the head with a shovel on the way in and was killed. Mm-hmm. So it was an extremely brutal.
I was going to say, because most of us, I'm sure it's true of our audience, it was true of me till I met you. I had never heard of Jasenovec. Mm-hmm. You know, and it was an especially brutal place.
It was an especially brutal place, and it was brutal without being so organized. Like Auschwitz, we know, you know, people were counted and organized, and it was organized, and people were gassed in this way and that way. This was much more ad hoc, you know, and they were just brutal people who, and people were killed in every which way. With
even buried alive, I think.
Yeah. I don't know so much burying alive. That would be too much trouble. They did in Jasenovac itself. There were other places where they would have to dig, you know, large number and then throw them in. And yes, but one thing that I have to say about Jasenovac before I forget is that it, as I said, it held Jews, of course, but also Roma, and of whom there were a fairly large number in Croatia, and most importantly, Serbs. Why is that important? It's important because it's still something that hangs over former Yugoslavia, and that in a sense was one of the precipitating moments in the breakup of Yugoslavia. I mean, horrible as it is, you know, it's like, if you kill me, then I kill you, and so there is never an end. There was never any true reconciliation or true examination of what really happened, or truthfully dealing with numbers and so on.
So with your uncle now in there, what did he had a fixed sentence, he's sent there, what was it like for him?
Well, he was in a sense very lucky, because the reason I talked about his age, he was born in 1885, was that, and he was frail, like much of his family. He probably wouldn't have made it through, but he did survive. He saw my father, by the way, there. My father was still alive, because my father was young and strong, and they put him to work. And he was starving, but he was still alive. And he told us that when he returned, and I know how my father ended up. So, but my uncle, they knew that he was a banker, and so they put him to run their accounts. So they put him, instead of digging, you know, clearing the problems of the Sava River and building things or running. There was a brick factory and a chain factory. Oh, there was whatever it's called, tanning factory. Instead of, I wouldn't call it factory, these are workshops, sort of. Instead of doing that kind of thing, he was put into an office to run the paperwork, to run their accounts. So that saved him. And there was a person in that office that was kind to him and gave him some extra food. After the war, the reverse had happened, and that guy ended up being incarcerated by the new government. And I remember my uncle sending him some packages. Right? And so I sort of wish that I knew who that person was, but I don't.
So while your uncle is now at Jasenovac, you and your brother are with your Aunt Giza.
Yes.
In 1943, while you're with your Aunt Giza, she is denounced.
Yes.
And taken.
Yes. She was denounced. I must say that my brother and I were there too, and nobody denounced us. It's like nobody was paying attention to us almost, it seems like. How did we just go there? How were we there? But she was denounced, and they came and picked her up. And as she was running off, trying to save herself, trying to get into the attic of a house next door, she went by the next door neighbors, and the name of the family was Runjak, and said, please take the children. And so this Catholic family, just ordinary family, of father and mother and 3 children older than we were, took us in. And my aunt was caught and deported to Auschwitz.
And you only recently learned what happened to her, didn't you?
Recently, because we have the archives from Germany here at the museum now, and I was able to get the record that she was there, and it says she died of intestinal problems. And of course, yes, you die of intestinal problems if you live in concentration camps and you're exposed to diseases and you're suffering from malnutrition. Right. You didn't necessarily have to be gassed. You can die in other ways. Yes, you can be killed in other ways.
So Aunt Giza's been taken. She's gone. And now you're with the family Runjak.
Yes, and it wasn't a huge period of time.
Right.
Because my uncle just happened to return at that time, because he tried to go and follow her and see if he could save her. But because she had gone to Germany, there was just no way of saving her. But I need to say that during the time that I was with the Runjak family, we actually had Ustaše armed forces bivouacked in our backyard. Our houses were, we had these 2 houses, and we were renting an apartment in the second house, and that's where the Runjak family lived. We had Ustaše all over the place. And so we were told, my brother and I, that we need to call Mrs. Runjak mom. And so we did, and my brother always called her mom from then on. I was old enough to know that she was not my mom. Right. And so I was able to switch. If the Ustaše were there, if somebody was there that I didn't know, that was Mrs. Runjak. But I would call her mom if there was somebody there. But if we were all by ourselves, she was Mrs. Runjak. I could switch back and forth. And
clearly the small town, the local people there knew who you were.
Everybody.
But no one denounced you. But
no one denounced me.
Yeah.
Sometimes if we knew that the Ustaše something special would be in town, like I remember that Pavelić, the head of the Ustaše, once came on a visit, and everybody wanted to go see it. See who he was. So I wanted to go, and of course I wasn't allowed because it was dangerous. And sometimes I would have to wear a hat on my head because I was a flaming redhead in those days. That was my natural color. And there aren't any redheads I was shocked when I came to this country and found how many redheads there are. So I would be, like, both of my brother and I were redhead. And so it was very unusual. So I would be kind of sticking out. So often, when I had to hide, I'd wear a hat, or there were other times we hid. I don't know whether we ever get to the point of how we hid how we used to have to hide in the basement where the fights were.
Well, I want us to get there very much. So I do want you to tell us, though, that you were baptized as Catholics, I believe, during that time. And why did that happen?
Well, during the time that I was with the Runjak family, we were, but my brother also, Mrs. Runjak was, they were very observant Catholics, and there was a local priest who was not apparently very sympathetic to the Jewish cause, and he told Mrs. Runjak at one point, well, what about these children? What are we going to do about them? Like, it was a threat. And so she thought that it was time to have us baptized to save us. At that point, my uncle was back, and she apparently must have told him, and so they decided that one thing to do would be to baptize us both, so we were baptized.
And just as an aside, I believe that particular priest was tried and convicted after the war.
Right, right.
So your uncle's back. He did try to find his wife, your Aunt Giza, and of course it was too late. Now you're living in really a battleground because the war is coming towards the latter stages. Tell us about that time for you.
Well, as I said, we were sort of in an area where the partisans were able to be fairly close in the mountains, and now they're becoming a real force. There would be battles, and we would try to hide during the time of the battle, because often the bullets would be going through our house. There was a time where when we were not able to go and hide in the basement, and we would be I was still in the living room, I remember that very well, and sitting sort of in a corner where I could be shielded by the walls, because we were living in a house that was built in the 1800s, and it was like huge, fat walls, but the bullets could come through the window. So there was a time that I was in a corner, and my uncle was in the room next door, and I was crying, and so he came, and just then a bullet flew through a bedroom window and into the place where he had been sleeping. So in a way, I saved his life. But other times, and of course, by the time the war ended, our house was we had these armoires that were all pierced with bullets. And the sheets looked like, something the child would do with the napkin, little holes. But sometimes we were able to run to the basement. Now, the basement was not an American-style basement. It was a cellar. And you had to get out of the house and down the stairs, and it was dirt floor. And that's where we used to have, we had a vineyard, and that's where we used to have barrels with wine and fruits and vegetables that would be put there for the winter. Tiny windows, but it was a safe place. And, there were frogs jumping around. I thought it was perfectly fine, but of course, I'm sure there was not an easy place to be. And we stayed there for quite a while. There were some kind of cots we put down, and because the battles were mostly at night. And then in the morning, you would peer out and see who was in charge. And if the Ustasher were in charge, well, you just knew you had to keep out of the way and hide as best you can. And if the partisans were in charge, then you could be free. And there were times, I have one image in my head of looking through the windows where they didn't want me to. The adults didn't want me to, and there were carts being pulled by horses, and the carts were full of bodies. it was, you know, pretty brutal time. And the Ustaše would retaliate when the partisans would win. And there was one time that I was going with, that was my aunt was already gone, and we had somebody helping us in the house. And she wanted to go to the movies, so she took me along, the lady who was taking care. And she was holding my eyes closed, supposedly, but I could see. And the main square was on every tree, it was full of trees, and on every tree there was at least one body hanging there, because they caught so many partisans and they just hanged them.
And that's an image you remember.
Yeah.
You shared with me that for you as a child, your terror was not about being arrested and deported. It was really about being killed by gunfire and explosions.
Yeah, well, that was, yeah.
Because that was so immediate.
That was very immediate, right? Because I didn't understand, I think I was too young to understand what it means to go to be deported to a concentration camp. I knew that my cousins were gone and they've disappeared, and of course they were killed. I don't know to what extent I understood.
Yeah. You survived through that. The war ends in May 1945. It's your brother and you and your uncle. That's three of you. Mm-hmm. Tell us about the war's end and also about what your uncle then did to try to deal with resuming a life, and now he's got two little children that he's caring for. Right.
So the war came to an end, and there was sort of expectation that maybe somebody would return. For a long time, people used to ask me, like strange people on the street would ask me, "Are you still hoping that your parents would return?" And the reason for that was that there were rumors that some people were taken to Russia, sent to Siberia, whatever. But of course, that wasn't so. There were some people who survived in the family, very few. One of my uncles on my mother's side and one uncle on my father's side survived as prisoners of war in Germany, because they were in the Yugoslav army when war started. Okay. And another uncle on my father's side survived because he and his fiancée, later wife, escaped to Hungary, and they were on this Kastner train that ended up in Bergen-Belsen, and from there they were rescued into Switzerland. And so eventually I heard from, so anyway, the two uncles, he did not come back, that one. He remained in Switzerland, and I connected with him later. But the two uncles who returned, they came to Ludbreg to see if anybody there was alive. And especially my father's brother wanted very much to take my brother and me. But of course, we didn't know him, and we didn't really want to go, and my uncle certainly was not wanting to give us up, right. Because now that's all he had left. He immediately, actually in 1946, he adopted us legally. And now the two uncles that wanted us to go with them weren't successful, because one of the things that happened was they asked me if I wanted to stay or go with them. And I said, I'm staying. And so at age 7, I had to make that decision. But I stayed. They both left. They eventually both ended up in what is now Israel. Mm-hmm. And they both remarried. Their spouses were killed, and actually one of them was not married before, but he got married also to survivors, and they ended up in Israel. And I never got to see my mother's brother again. But my father's brother, I did see, and the first time I saw him was actually he came to Switzerland to my wedding. So
that was the first time.
Yeah.
Of course, not long after you were adopted by Uncle Ludovic, your brother died.
Yes. Yes, unfortunately, having survived the war, he contracted scarlet fever and died. There were 3 children, 3 little boys in town that contracted scarlet fever, and he must have had a weak heart, that's what they said, and there were no antibiotics, and he died very, very fast. So from then on, it was just my uncle and I.
What do you know or can recall about when your brother died, the impact on your uncle? He's lost his wife, your aunt, he's adopted you, and now he loses his now adopted son.
Well, yeah, it was devastating, and it took him forever. I don't think he ever got over it. Right. But he concentrated on taking care of me, and I was very, very lucky that he was a very loving person, and I had a very good home. We had, housekeepers and so on, who, tried to do their best, and I ended up then going away into high school even. I actually had to go away because there was no academic high school in that town, in town of Ludovic. It was like 25 kilometers away, which is like 12 miles, so it's no distance. However, that was before cars. Trains took an hour, and my uncle was insisting that I had to go to music school. I never mentioned that, so much to talk about, but in camp, they also, when he was in concentration camp in Jasenovac, they knew that he could play the violin and that he had groups before. So they wanted to be entertained, so they had him put together a choir, and they were putting performances on. So to my uncle, it was always, music is so important, you have to, so I had to go to music school in the afternoon and regular school in the morning. So I was staying in this other town. And by that point, I had connected to my uncle in Switzerland, and
I want you to, I want you to tell us about that. I want you to, in the time we have left, I want you, with the context for our audience,
very much.
You are living now under a communist government.
Oh, yes.
So life is...
This is the thing. We went from fascism to communism.
Just like that.
Like that. And so it wasn't possible, actually, to leave Yugoslavia, of course. But my uncle from Switzerland wrote to me and said, could I come and visit? And because the communist government considered me what they called a victim of fascism, I was given a passport. And
because you had this designation, you were a victim of fascism.
And the Swiss gave me eventually a visa. And so when I was in 10th grade, I went, at the end of 10th grade, I went to Switzerland. And that's the first time I saw any of my family since early childhood, so, very young child, since I was a very young child. So I ended up now I found myself in an Orthodox Jewish family. My aunt and uncle had 2 children, and one of them was already 7 at that time, and the other one was a 1-year-old, I think. And it was quite a shock because at that point, I had no knowledge of anything Jewish. Not only was I living first in Catholic country, and but nobody was observing any religion during the communist regime. Right. So I went from that to the Orthodox family, but they're a lovely family, and I enjoyed being with them. And I was there for a month, and then they said, well, when you go back, why don't you try and come here when you are at the university? And that's what happened.
And you got permission again.
I got permission.
Which had to be really unusual.
I got permission again. It was fairly unusual, yeah, to get permission to leave in a communist world.
To go to a Western country.
Yeah, yeah.
So you go to Switzerland and live with them. How was that for Uncle Ludovic?
Well, obviously hard.
Yeah.
And I felt very bad at, leaving him behind. But I thought I was going to be for a year, I'm going to go back in a year and I'm just, going to study French and I'll be fine. Well, that's not what happened.
Well, you have, I just want you to hear about how she met her husband, because I like this.
So I got on that train to go to Switzerland to study for a year. And on the train, there were 3 young men having a very lovely discussion outside in the hallway. In like a European train, you have a compartment and then a hallway. And the train was very full, so they were standing in the hallway arguing. And I had been studying...
In English, right?
In English. Yeah. And I had studied English from 5th grade, eighth grade on. From 8th grade on, I studied English and I loved the language. And when I went to the university, I was an English major. And so but I had no opportunity to actually hear native speakers of English or be able to speak English to a native speaker. So I was like all ears trying to hear what they were talking about. What are they talking about? It was 1957 in the fall. It was time of the horrible things that were happening in Little Rock, Arkansas, with the children being not allowed to get into high school, and Governor Frobel standing and not allowing kids to enter high school, and eventually the president having to send the troops to prevent these children from being maligned. So that's what they were talking about. And one of the guys was accusing one of the guys was a Yugoslav, and the other one, obviously a communist, otherwise he would be going out of the country. And the other one was, and the one who was being accused was an American. That was who was being told, like, what kind of a country is this? What kind of behavior is that? How can you be like that? And the young man was trying to say, well, it's not me, and it's not most of us. Most of us believe in freedom and equality for all, and I'm sure this is going to end. So when this discussion ended, I passed through the hallway, and this young man who was being accused of this bad activity by our American government said to me, pretty red hair. And I smiled and I said, oh, you speak English. But from then on, we started speaking and we talked for quite a while until he got off in Venice and I continued. And then we exchanged addresses, and then he wrote to me and I wrote back and wrote again and I wrote back. And a year later, he returned and we were married. So that's the story. And of course, then you moved here in 1958, but you were able to see your Uncle Ludovic again. Yes. Well, of course, I could not go back. We had to get married in Switzerland and come here. I could not go to Yugoslavia at that time because I was afraid that I would not be able to get a visa to come out again.
Right. It's one thing to send you off for a year to university.
Yeah. And now I'm leaving for forever, and this was not going to work. So I did not go back, but I went back as soon as I could, which means when I got an American citizenship, which I got as fast as I could. And so at that time I had 2 children already. People think you can get a citizenship like that when you get married. It doesn't work that way. You have to wait several years and apply and pass a test and so on. And then I went back and I was able to go twice on these trips. It wasn't easy in those days to also just like take off for Europe, especially we were young and bringing up 2 children, but I managed to go twice before he passed away.
I think we're going to have to close our program. There's so much that Dora had to skip over, as you can probably guess. So much more we'd like to have heard about, but I'm going to turn back to Dora in just a moment to close our program. We didn't get a chance for you to ask Dora a question, but when Dora's done, Dora will remain on the stage, and we invite anybody in the audience, all of you if you want, come up on the, she can take it, come up on the stage and meet her, get your picture taken with her, or ask that question if you have one. You're willing to do that, right?
Of course.
So Dora will stay on stage. I want to thank all of you for being with us. Remind you we'll have programs in most weeks. It's Wednesdays and Thursdays. This week just a little different because of July 4th. But Wednesdays and Thursdays until August 8th. You can see all of our programs on our YouTube channel, so we hope you'll either come back or see one of our programs. It's Don't Go Yet. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. And so with that, I'm going to turn back to Dora to close today's program. And again, we'll invite you to come up if you want once she's finished.
Can you from here?
Yeah.
So I wrote something down because I wanted to make sure that I don't fumble as we go along. And I wanted to be sure that you get my message in a straight way. So when I visited Jakovo last year, that concentration camp where there were 50 children that were murdered there. It was just in a most awful way. To just see those graves was just unbelievable. Why were there graves to begin with? Is because somebody took it upon themselves to actually put down the names when they were burying them surreptitiously. So thinking of that, thinking also of a friend of mine who actually, we were at the funeral yesterday. She was separated from her parents when she was a baby. She was born in a concentration camp. In a ghetto. She was born in the Warsaw ghetto, and the people smuggled her out. The parents smuggled her out to a Catholic family, who then sheltered her until the end of the war. And when the mother returned, she didn't want to go to the parents because she didn't know who she was. It's very hard, must have been awful to be separated from her parents and then to have to go back to her parents, not knowing who they were. But I'm thinking of that, and I also think about my baby brother, who was separated from our mother so that he would survive. The agony felt by my mother is on my mind as I watch the shocking news and hear about the events on our southern border. Young children, even babies, being separated from their parents. All I can think of and say is not now, not here, not in this country. No, this is not the Holocaust, what's going on now, no. But it's not the best we can do either. So I want to join those on both sides of the political spectrum who ask for an end of the practice of separating families and for the best possible care for the children. Having lived through the Holocaust, I find it imperative to plead for the humane treatment for those who seek our help. And I will continue to speak about my past in the hope that a reminder of that past may inspire us all to see that tolerance, compassion, empathy, and respect for others makes for a better world for all. Thank you very much for being here.